my name is Melissa Drake, and for my presentation, I will be discussing the film Asian Men, The Slanted Screen. And for those of you who don't know, The Slanted Screen is a film produced and written by Jeff Adachi, in which he highlights on the hardships faced by many Asian American actors in the film industry and kind of exposes the ways of which these men were stereotyped and how they are labeled and what gives them the identity that they have today. So to begin, I did want to talk about how even though their impact on the film industry can be related to our modern time films, we have to backtrack where all of this began. So during the first instances in the film industry, many Asian roles were casted by white men, and in this case, that's where the term yellowface has come about. Asian actors were barely casted to play Asian roles, and for that, many stereotypes were created. Stereotypes that we see even in our modern day society. And although Asian Americans played a leading role with their contributions made for having an American dream, they couldn't obtain that dream for themselves without the presence of ignorance and prejudice. With time, more Asian actors were casted in Hollywood films. However, they were only casted to the extent of those stereotypes, which further led to the desexualization of Asian American men simply due to the fact that Americans were uncomfortable with seeing Asian men portrayed in such a sexual and powerful light. Up until the coming of Sessue Hayakawa, he was the first sex symbol of Hollywood that gave him the concept, or I should say, the title of sexual appeal. He was the sexual appeal of Hollywood. To further that, Hayakawa challenged the entire concept of desexualization when theaters were filled with people to watch him overpower these women, which didn't seem as uncomfortable as they thought. Also, having the ability to play other races within the many films he starred in, he was also the last to do so. Asian actors did not have the freedom to play who they wanted to or even expand beyond the stereotype. In the film, we also hear of the legend Bruce Lee, who was another actor who set the bar for Asian actors, but he was also the stereotype. The portrayal that all Asian actors should be as Bruce Lee was the start of how Asian actors obtained that identity through the stereotype of Lee's ability to master martial arts. So, as we know in most of these films that we watch, many Asian men are portrayed to be either nerdy or people kind of stereotypically label them as people who know can master the arts and etc. There wasn't any room for Asians to have that say in which they could portray themselves. They had to challenge that stereotype. In the documentary, it mentioned that Bruce Lee can be praised for giving Asian men pride. And after the coming of Bruce Lee, Asians were casted in diverse roles, but were limited to putting them in roles that belittled them, such as being servants or waiters. Asian children were very sensitive to comprehending that if Asian men weren't leads in television shows, they weren't important. It wasn't validating. It felt very disempowering because now we're viewing these Asian men in a light that humiliates them, which gives children this limited aspiration of what they want to do in life without having those Asian men lead roles as role models. Their roles are pushed to specific categories that portrays them, and that limits, again, any aspirations that the children may have due to lack of diversity in role models. All of the men who were interviewed had bigger hopes of playing non-stereotypical roles and telling the stories that they wanted to tell. Thankfully, the new generation of directors and producers had the ability to put Asians on the mainstream, and that caused for the emerging of truthful Asian portrayals in Hollywood films, which further translates to these new generation of filmmakers gave Asian men the light that they needed to portray the characters that were truthfully them. Redefining and bringing to light the injustices of the past in order to see these Asian actors in their own light, the new group of filmmakers have done exactly what the men who paved the way for Asian actors would have wanted. Collectively coming together to challenge the stereotypes in rebellious ways can set Asian actors on the path to unlimited success in the film industry. And I further want to discuss the stereotypes and the archetypes that we notice in the film. And many of the stereotypes as we go over are what I've mentioned before, being the typical nerdy or the typical martial arts master or someone who serves the white man, I should say. Having the ability to know martial arts or being portrayed as nerdy, that further led to them being casted as fighters and gangsters and the waiters and servers, but it put them in a bad light that made them out to be bad guys. Asian men were never casted above white men, and they had villainous roles that had the implication that Asian men were out for white men and trying to take what was theirs. The same goes along with casting men as nerdy, which all translated to how their experiences with women were little to none. They had no sexual appeal, and for that being the reason why they weren't casted for any leading roles. The problem roots to a dehumanizing factor. Seeing them as powerless, and in order to serve that purpose, you either had to take the power by being a bad guy or simply stick to having no power at all. That gave many Asian men no ability to defend themselves, which leads to many roles being below or serving for the white man. So what can we take from this specifically? Gender plays a big role in the media, specifically towards Asian men. In this case, Asian men were set based on the stereotypes that were made for them by the white men. They had all power taken from them. They weren't able to put that face on for themselves without having judgment from white directors that they didn't want. They basically had a pleasing factor, that if it didn't please the media, it wasn't going to be made. So with those stereotypes, we see that these Asian men, if they collectively come together to challenge that stereotype, be rebellious, be creative, they can collectively come together and challenge that and make the way out for themselves rather than having to wait and just continue with what the mainstream media has made for them, when they can rise above the bar and kind of set that goal for themselves.